I've had a fascination with British railways for years, ever since I was a little kid watching Thomas the Tank Engine, only to see him a few weeks ago. I moved to Sodor to fill my fascination for the trains with faces. Beforehand, I lived in a little village in central England. When I was a child, I used to sleep listening to the sounds of distant diesel horns as rain pelted on the roof. Good times. My grandfather, on the other hand, worked on a branch line during the later years of the London Midland and Scottish Railway. He used to tell me stories of when he was a cleaner, then a fireman, and finally becoming an engine driver. It was always my dream just to be like him, to go soaring down the line, holding on the regulator as the reels pounded the rails. Of course, though, as you probably know, that wasn't to be. Unfortunately, he had passed away a few years ago. But one of his stories he told me has always stuck with me. I was about 13 years old, and I was reading one of his old railway books. I flicked through the pages as the wind whistled lightly outside, and the old clock ticked away in the dining room. The clouds made shadows that danced over the walls as the sun shone brightly. My eyes darted from page to page as I read about Elmis Black Fives, Great Western Kings, Gresley A1s, and Bullied Pacifics. Then I stopped. A small photograph fell out of the book and landed lightly on my lap. I placed the still open book on my legs and picked up the photo to examine it. It was slightly worn, probably from the book, and was in black and white. On it was a picture of an engine shed with 6 rows. Then I noticed something. There were what looked like 2 scrapped engines poking out of the last 2 rows of the sheds, and I was curious to know more about the photo. "Grandpa," I called out, "come have a look at this." I heard the back door open and the old wooden floorboards of the floor creak as I heard my dear old grandfather walk out into the lounge room. "Yes, Benny boy." His warm smile and his glasses reflected off the sun as I turned the photo around to show him. "What is this photo?" He carefully picked up the photo from my little hands as he adjusted his glasses slightly. But after a few moments, his face turned into a frown. Not taking his eyes off the photo, he asked, "Where did you find this, Ben?" "It was in this old railway book," I replied slightly, more curious than I was beforehand. He then turned his gaze to the book and looked down. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" I asked. He then turned his head back to the photo and uttered, "This is where the bad engines go." I was puzzled by his answer. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" He sighed and turned to sit in the seat opposite of me. "Not all engines are good, lad," he began. "You should know that by now with your books and all. This here," he held up the photo to me, "is where the real bad engines go. None of this sending you back to the other railway rubbish." I tilted my head slightly at him, still confused. He sighed. "See that engine on the page there?" I looked down to the book to see a Midland 1F pulling a train of vans. "Yes?" I asked, confused about where he was going with this. He leaned back in his old lounge chair and began to tell me the story. "The engine's name in the photo was Robert. He was a shunter and pulled small goods trains on the branch line I worked on during the 40s. Robert was a bad apple, you could say. His twin brother Ken was the exact opposite. A noble, hard-working engine he was. You ask him anything, and he would do it. The other engines liked Ken, but they all despised Robert for the accidents he would cause. But since this was during war times, the accidents were all covered up. Only the engines allocated to the sheds near the branch line knew of Robert's accidents. It was obvious to no one that Robert was jealous of Ken to no end and would try to be better than him to the point where he'd get into trouble. One night, the twins were sent to a nearby scrapyard. The scrapyard's engine had broken down and needed replacement. They got to work as soon as they arrived. A few hours in, Robert was sent to do some of the dirty work in the smelter shed, while Ken was sent elsewhere in the scrapyard. Why did they choose him instead of me? Robert pondered angrily. Then, it happened. I don't know why or how, but Robert just broke. Robert pulled beside Ken in the scrap shed, covered in black soot, and politely asked, "Could you help me in the smelter shed? I need to pull a line of molten scrap trucks out, but they're too heavy." Ken was surprised by his benevolent demeanor. When they pulled up to the trucks, Ken was in the front and Robert was behind. They slowly let the molten scrap pour out. Then they reached the last truck, the one closest to Ken. As it began pouring, Robert used all of his strength and suddenly moved backwards as hard as he could. Ken was pulled back, right under the molten scrap. He screamed in terror as the viscous orange liquid bubbled down his boiler and crested his face. A few moments later, there was a loud explosion. Ken was no more. Robert would finally be the favorite. He would be the one who would show the engines that he wasn't all bad and could be useful. But obviously that wasn't to be. When our controller asked Robert about what happened, he blatantly replied, "He went in reverse. I tried to hold back, but I couldn't." Of course, our controller, knowing Robert, didn't believe him for a second. The controller just shook his head and walked away from him. Robert returned to the sheds, smiling, and fell asleep straight away with the thought that he'd gotten away with it. The next morning, the driver and I were sent to take him to a new location that we'd never heard before. Of course, we obliged and fired him up. The controller was also there to see him off. "Well, Robert, after last night's accident, we can't have you on this railway anymore." "You can't send me away, sir," he angrily replied. "I have to do Ken's work for him until there's a replacement." "It's always been about you," sighed the controller. "Your brother is dead, and you don't even care. I'm ashamed of you. I'm sending you to a place where you'll finally be useful. That will be all." He turned around and walked away. Robert smirked. I didn't want to be on this sodding railway anyway. Then we set off. The trip went smoothly until we reached the place as rumbling storm clouds approached. The sun began to fade over the horizon in the opposite direction. A large gated-up line with signs reading, "No trespassing," and "Warning, no exiting engines allowed." "What is this place?" the driver asked, but I ignored his question as an armed guard walked up to the engine.
Number's 2630. We've been expecting you."
Another man slowly opened the barbed wire gate. Then we went in. The place was unkept. Pieces of scrapped engines littered throughout the facility. 4 sheds gloomed as thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain began. A man stood out in front of the shed and walked up to the cab. 2630? he asked in a gruff voice. We nodded, and he nodded back as he walked into the shed. The rain was pouring heavily at this point. Inside the shed, it was pitch black as we slowly moved inside. Robert's eyes darted around, even though we couldn't see anything. Suddenly, we heard it. Quiet at first, but then it grew louder and louder. It was moaning and crying coming from around the shed. Then the lights came on. There must have been at least 30 engines in this singular shed. They were barely alive. Some missing parts, others missing their eyes, and one was an old engine that sat on wooden boards. Just a boiler An unknown black liquid dripped slowly onto the floor from one of his eyeless sockets. "No!" cried Robert. "You can't leave me here!" "Were you bad?" His eyes looked around frantically to see an eyeless engine awaiting death. "No, I was good, honest," he replied. "You lie," he groaned quietly as rain pelted the corrugated iron roof. "Good engines don't lie. You're here to rot, like the rest of us." A tear rolled down his face as the driver and I backed out of the shed, horrified by the sight of the engines. Then one spoke up. "Please take me with you. I'll be a good. I promise." Then the others began to yell over each other with a fraction of a hope that they'd get to leave. That's when I realized that they were all bad. Every single one of them. They only cared about themselves and not for the well-being of the others around them. They were self-obsessed, greedy. In a word, they were bad. Then, just as quick as it began, they all stopped and fell silent, the only sound being the cries of Robert begging for him to leave. "Good engines don't lie. Good engines don't lie. Good engines don't lie." As we backed out into the rain, I could hear the screams of Robert as the door slowly closed behind him. The man standing out in front gave us both a bus ticket, tipped his hat, and then returned to the side of the shed. The driver and I were silent as we returned back to the branch line. When we did return, we saw a controller by the workman's hut, waiting for us. "Ah, gentlemen," he called to us. "I hope your trip was uncharacteristically normal?" "Sir, what was that place?" I asked him. He blatantly replied, "That is where the bad engines go. A lot of branch lines in Britain have been using it for years." "But why not scrap them?" asked the driver. Too much labor. Only the bad mainline engines get scrapped. We don't have the money to have every bad one scrapped. Those non-faceless engines cost quite a pretty pound, you know." Then he turned. "That will be all, gentlemen. I hope to see you both tomorrow." And with that, he left. But as he did, a small photo fell out of his pocket. When the door closed, I picked it up. That is the picture I have here. We just looked at each other and left. He said, as the clock continued to tick in the background and the sun shone through the windows. The driver and I worked on that railway for a few more weeks until we were transferred to another line near Edinburgh. I was left speechless by the account and stayed silent throughout the entire story, shocked by the graphic recount. "Anyways, Ben, come on. Let's go out into the garden for a while and enjoy the sun for a bit. That's enough reading for today." We stood up and walked outside. The wooden floorboards creaked and the wind lightly whistled outside. But as we did, I glanced at the photo one last time. The dark clouds, the engines awaiting their fate as the days rolled on. I couldn't help but wonder, are they still there? Alone, cold, seeking death? I'll never be sure. I never asked my grandfather about that place again. I guess I just erased it from my mind and forgot that horrific story. Until now. So when you read about the engines in the railway series, and how there are no bad steam engines whatsoever, well, you all know where the bad engines go.